host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
Well, hello and welcome to our special G20 segment with just under 2 weeks to go before world leaders gather for the G20 Summit this November. Today, we turn our focus to one of the most defining issues of our time, and that, of course, is global health. The G20 Health Ministers meeting held in Polokwane in Limpopo concluded without a declaration, while all member nations agreed on the principle of equitable access to health care. The United States' decision to withhold its endorsement once again highlights the tension between national interest and global solidarity, as we've heard from some critics. We'll unpack what was discussed with our reporters and also our health experts. In fact, I'm now joined in studio by SABC News specialist researcher Zandi Lemieza. Zandi, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. So, of course, Zandi, we've been monitoring what has been happening at the Health Ministers Summit in Polokwane. We've had our reporter there also just monitoring those proceedings. We know, of course, that not declaration yet was signed because of the United States, as I said in my introduction, but you've also been focused on health matters, particularly for G20. Just give us your view then in some of the things, the key issues that you've been monitoring.
Thank you, Unati. From a bird's eye view, it was quite interesting to observe the participation of finance ministers from the G20 member states participating in this health ministers meeting at the decision-making table where all things equitable quality healthcare are being discussed. It was also very encouraging to see that the parallel conversation around financing healthcare also requires health ministers to partner with those who are willing to bring the money forward to build these strong and resilient health systems. So it was quite interesting to see that throughout this health ministers meeting, a conversation around financing healthcare and working together with partners that can make the finances available for healthcare service delivery.
All right, so of course we have all of those key points there on the monitor. But Zandi, just speak to us then about some of those key issues around pandemics. I know that there was also a key focus on TB, HIV. Speak to us about those.
So pandemic preparedness, pandemic prevention, preparedness and response was still quite a topical issue. Yeah. Health ministers agreed that being pandemic ready is still a critical collaborative approach that is needed. But TB remains a very good focal point along with HIV/AIDS. These are two communicable diseases, or infectious diseases rather, that remain on the global health agenda as part of the Sustainable Development Goal framework. And essentially at this health ministers meeting, they were discussing how can we bring about a vaccine candidate and how can we make a vaccine available for TB. For HIV, all discussions were centered around HIV prevention. There's been a lot of developments scientifically around lenacapavir, pre-exposure prophylaxis. So health ministers were discussing how do we scale up HIV prevention and how do we get a TB vaccine.
Absolutely. One of the other things that we did, particularly because this is our second time focusing on health, which is important, we talked about financing. It's always an issue, right? Particularly when you look at just the debt in developing countries, some spending more to service debt than education and health. Speak to us about what's going to be happening then just on the in terms of the funding, particularly raising those much needed funds. I know that there is a huge day that is going to be held around just funding, particularly before the Leaders Summit on the 22nd.
Thank you, Unachi. That's a really important question because the Global Fund raises funds in a multi-year cycle, which is called replenishments. And currently we're sitting on the 7th one with the 8th one due. And it's essentially a multi-country pool of funds where countries need to pledge. Interestingly enough, at this health ministers meeting, there was an advocacy event whereby they were rallying and encouraging G20 member states to pledge to this global fund. We know that just a day ahead of the Leaders Summit on the 21st of November, 2025, there will be a Global Fund 8th Replenishment Summit where G20 countries and member states and supporting regions can pledge towards this fund to fight TB, HIV, and malaria. And of course, increase access to healthcare through universal health coverage.
Of course, we are going to be speaking to Professor Yates a little bit later on this particular segment. Hopefully he'll help unpack, just how they're going to go about getting those critical funding, particularly when most of the countries are aligned, but not all of them are aligned. But Zandi, thank you so much for unpacking that for us. Zandi Mieza is a specialist researcher right here at the SABC. All right, let's continue then on this. The G20 Health Ministers meeting, as we've been saying, has now concluded in Polokwane without signing a declaration. All countries in the G20 agreed with the overall goal of equal access to healthcare services, except the United States of America. Member states, as well as other invited nations, dissected important issues of advancing healthcare services globally. One of the key takeaways from the summit is for the world to be prepared for the next pandemic. Now, that's a big one. Now, the common theme for the meeting centered around inclusivity, equity, and solidarity. South Africa's Health Minister, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, says that the decision by the US has prevented the G20 meeting from signing a declaration. Let's watch.
On the final day of the G20 Health Ministers meeting in Polokwane, South Africa's Health Minister Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi delivered an address of what is referred to as the minister's statement instead of a declaration, and that is because one country, the United States of America, is in disagreement with majority of what is being discussed, centered around the theme for the G20 Health Ministers meeting, which are issues of solidarity, equality, sustainability, and inclusivity. The United States simply saying they are in disagreement.
We don't have a declaration. We have got what you call a minister statement. In terms of the rules of G20, if just one country is not in agreement with the issues that we have raised, then you can't have a declaration, but a minister statement. What I was reading here was a minister statement because the US have rejected everything I'm saying now except the issue or some issues in fighting the NCDs. Otherwise, all the other issues, they've rejected. I forgot the issue of even climate change on health. They don't believe there's any climate change. They don't believe in pandemic preparedness fight. In fact, right from the beginning, they told us even the theme, they don't agree with it. The theme of solidarity, equity, and sustainability. In fact, they told us when we started that if any declaration has got the word equity, solidarity, they are not going to agree. So we knew right from the get, or gender equality, or diversity, or inclusiveness, or all those things they told us they are not in agreement.
The minister was unable to then deliver a declaration.
It simply means whatever the declaration can have won't include health declaration beyond the fact that it's a chairperson statement. Because the overwhelming majority of these countries have accepted everything. As I'm telling you, is the US. In fact, after the meeting, many countries came to me after I briefed them that we are going to issue a minister statement. They emphasized that we must write there that overwhelming majority of countries agree. These are just international conventions.
The G20 Health Ministers meeting and health working group has successfully concluded in Polokwane. Ministers as well as medical experts and policy makers sat together and deliberated on advancing strategies towards creating a resilience in the public health system. A number of countries participated in the G20 Health Ministers meeting.
We strongly commend South Africa's presidency of the G20. I mean, this is an historic moment. We highly appreciate the values South Africa is presenting, solidarity, equality, solidarity, values Norway fully support. And we have a good and long-lasting cooperation with South Africa on many health-related issues. So this has been a very important meeting where we have discussed universal health coverage, how we can combat non-communicable diseases, how we can prepare better for the next pandemic, and how we can build an even stronger global health architecture.
You've engaged in a bilateral meeting with our Minister of Health, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi. How did that go?
I think that was a very productive meeting. We know that there are ongoing discussions here in South Africa now about universal health coverage. We did share some of the experiences we have from Norway. We cover our population with the universal health access, and we have done so for decades. And that's working very well, actually. I mean, we have some challenges as well, but making sure that everybody can access the best healthcare, no matter if they have a high income, low income, where they're based in the country, if they're old, if they're young, if they're rich, if they're poor. We think that's good for everybody, because we also know that universal healthcare, it's not only fair, it's not only sustainable, but it makes us better prepared for potential health crisis, and it also brings up the productivity and the economic growth in a country. So investing in public healthcare system, investing in universal health coverage, that's also good for our economies. And that's one of the insights we discussed, and it's interesting also to follow the discussions here in South Africa. And I mean, if we can learn from each other, that's great.
One of the main focal points for the G20 Health Ministers meeting is reducing the impact of HIV as a public health threat by 2030.
Diseases knows no boundary, and that there's a need to have global health security. There's a need for equity in health. There's a need for sustainability, that the G20 ministers for health should actually advocate for ownership, government ownership of health commodities, health products, health services across the African continent. And we believe that with the support of the G20, Africans should start taking that lead and that steps for sustainability, in the health sector.
Let's zoom into Nigeria. What sort of disease scale, or what are some of the problematic, communicable as well as non-communicable diseases that mostly impact your nation?
Well, tuberculosis is one of it, is one of the high burden diseases that we have in Nigeria. Malaria, obviously, is one of it. HIV, we also have about 2 million Nigerians living with HIV. And so we have issues with maternal health, infant health, and so mostly communicable diseases. But we also have a rising incidence of non-communicable diseases like hypertension, diabetes. So across board, we believe that we all need to work together.
Of course, the UNAIDS is also participating at this very important G20 Health Ministers meeting.
On the margins of this meeting, UNAIDS launched a report by a global council we commissioned on inequality, AIDS, and pandemics. And the focus I have had at this meeting is that inequalities drive pandemics, make outbreaks of disease turn into pandemics, prolong pandemics, make them more deadly, make them more economically disruptive, make more people unequal within countries, and then the cycle continues of inequalities driving pandemics, that we need to break this cycle. And I kept repeating the messages of the research done by this Global Council over 2 years of what works to break the pandemic's inequalities cycle. First, in this region of Africa, the inequality in access to finance is making countries unable to launch effective responses to AIDS and other pandemics.
The statement, as well as the inputs and deliberations taken during this G20 Health Ministers meeting, will then be presented to the heads of state of respective G20 nations on the 22nd and 23rd of November in Johannesburg. SABC News, Polokwane.
All right, to help us unpack all of this is Robert Yates, a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. Professor, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. So, given, Prof, that the G20 Health Ministers meeting, of which, in fact, you attended, ended without a declaration, I mean, how significant is the United States' refusal to endorse the final declaration, do you think, especially given just what we've been hearing now? There are concerns, of course, around investment and the importance of funding.
Yes, it is very significant and also extremely disappointing. And as the Honourable Minister said, I think the Americans made it very clear early on that they weren't going to support any declaration that referred to equity and fairness and things like that. Very, very disappointing because they're really going back on UN declarations they've agreed to in the past, particularly around universal health coverage. There's a specific UN declaration on that in 2012. Also, the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the targets is explicitly universal health coverage. But in the session on finance, the Americans made it very clear again that they basically, well, at least this administration, doesn't believe in universal health coverage, whereas the rest of the G20 patently do. So extremely disappointing.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been seeing it in a number of working groups across the board. Prof, so the G20 then continues to stress the need, for global preparedness for future pandemics. I mean, every time we hear of that word pandemics, there is somewhat of a panic. What are the most glaring financial or even governance gaps that still exist, do you think, and how can they be bridged, just in the current fiscal climate, especially when you look at, what's happening across the board?
Well, I think the key thing about tackling pandemics is to have a universal health system that everybody gets all the health services they need. And of course, that includes promotion, prevention, curative services, the whole spectrum of all services. And I think that to do that, you need a socialized health financing system. And the good news is that this is what South Africa is planning to do with the launch of the NHI, is create a socialized, publicly financed health system. And this is the real foundation that you need to have good pandemic preparedness. But of course, this requires public financing, and this is where you need the treasuries and the heads of government to make sure that the money is available for that.
And how would one then, how do you access the practicality, or assess rather the practicality of establishing a global health emergency fund? I mean, given current geopolitical tensions and shrinking national budgets, we know, of course, that there's an important day around financing for the G20 Health Ministers on the 21st of November. That's a day before the Leaders Summit.
Yes, and I think, we are in this very new world, sadly, that we've seen, I think, during the pandemic, really, the West, in many respects, neglected Africa. And we stockpiled vaccines, didn't allow tech transfers. And I think there was a terrible lack of solidarity, particularly around international financing of these instruments that were going to protect the world. And frankly, it's got even worse since the pandemic, and you've seen these huge aid cuts. I think in all reality, it's going to be domestic public financing is going to be the answer. And I think there are some African leaders, I think the South African president, the Rwandan president, are recognizing that domestic financing is the key. So the international aid and things like Global Fund will help, but at the end of the day, it's going to be domestic public financing that will make all the difference.
Yeah, and Prof, as we look at the World Summit, the world obviously will be focusing on the Leaders Summit. What would a meaningful health outcome or even commitment look like, one that balances national interests with collective responsibility, particularly because, that there was no clear declaration that was signed, and also looking at some of the Sustainable Development Goals that are still yet to be met?
Well, obviously, the news that the American government aren't going to attend whatsoever now is obviously extremely worrying, and one wonders how they are going to come up with a declaration in mind that you need all countries to sign up. So I think we should set our expectations sort of fairly low, to be perfectly honest. But I think the good news, and I very much saw this at Polokwane last week, is that South Africa is right at the forefront of these issues, talking about solidarity, universal health coverage. And I think with the exception of the United States, there was great solidarity amongst other countries, very big, powerful nations. So I do think that even though this has been a difficult process, I think that South Africa's leadership on this has been tremendous, particularly the focus on universal coverage and equity, because really that's what the rest of the world wants and needs. So I think congratulations to South Africa for trying, but obviously in the current geopolitical world, it's very, very difficult to come to a consensus about anything at the moment.
Yeah, and I want to talk about some of those themes that you speak of. I mean, the meeting's theme centered really on inclusivity, equity, and solidarity. In practical terms, though, I mean, what mechanisms are needed to ensure that equitable access to healthcare isn't just a slogan, but a measurable outcome?
Yes, well, actually, that is, at least conceptually, very, very straightforward. I mean, the world has learned that you can only have a health system that is truly inclusive and equitable if it's publicly financed. And of course, the one country that illustrates that reach universal health coverage through a privately financed system is the United States. It spends 18 population are excluded. And in fact, access to healthcare is the issue that has resulted in the American government shutting down at the moment. And I must say that having been observing the system in South Africa, unfortunately, your current system does have some of those traits, a two-tier system, a very inefficient private insurance system. So I think unless you socialize your health financing system, you run the risk of sort of sleepwalking into an American system. But the great news is that so many of the other G20 countries have made the transition. We heard on the previous clip, Norway made the transition to a universal health system. We have in the UK as well. Japan has too. So I think there are so many examples. And I think with the NHI now, you too have a roadmap to achieve this situation where the healthy, wealthy subsidize services for the sick and the poor, and that is the route to UHC.
Prof, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Unfortunately, that line, not the greatest, but thank you so much. That was Robert Yates, visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. Well, at the heart of this year's discussions, of course, at the Health Ministers meeting, were three urgent priorities as we've been discussing: pandemic preparedness, equitable access to medicines, and sustainable financing for health systems. All right, so let's take you to this now. Expectations are high as South Africa gears up to host the G20 Summit this month. The agenda is extensive, with over 130 meetings held across the country since South Africa assumed over the Global Forum's presidency from Brazil in December last year. Pretoria says it wants this global gathering to prioritize Africa's interests. Here's Kaelihle Khumalo with more.
The global focus will shift to South Africa as it prepares to host a G20 summit amid a myriad of global challenges, including trade wars, conflicts, inequality, and climate change. Preparations are in full swing at the Nasrec Expo Center south of Johannesburg, where world leaders from the richest countries will meet. For South Africa's priorities are pretty clear.
We expect the summit to make a clear political commitment to address debt vulnerabilities that low-income and middle-income countries are suffering under at the moment. We want to see the issue of the cost of debt being addressed, because many countries are having to spend the income or the revenue they have largely to pay back debt and not to advance their people's developmental needs such as education, health, and many others, and infrastructure.
Pretoria seeks to push for the reforms of global institutions, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and tackling the scourge of inequalities.
For us in South Africa, being the most unequal country in the world, and also Namibia, I'm so delighted to have my sister here, Monica Gengos, for having not only being here, but also for having launched the report that she worked on together with others on breaking the inequality pandemic cycle, building true health security in a global age. It's interesting that the two countries that are really at the top of league of unequal countries should be acting together to launch reports on inequality.
You as leaders can do something about it. But that's this, and the second message is, if you're going to do something, do it on the basis of facts and our understandings of the sources, the dimensions, the interrelations, the consequences, what we know from what has worked and what has not in various contexts. Every place is different, but so we're not going to tell any particular country, but we can, this panel can say, this has worked, this has failed, this is the reason this has failed. But inequality is a choice, and you can do something, but do it on the basis of theory and evidence.
US President Donald Trump has indicated that he won't come to the historic event.
For generations, Miami has been a haven for those fleeing communist tyranny in South Africa. I mean, if you take a look at what's going on in parts of South Africa, look at South Africa, what's going on. Look at South America, what's going on. You know, I'm not going to, we have a G20 meeting in South Africa. South Africa shouldn't even be in the G's anymore, because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told him I'm not going. I'm not going to represent our country there. It shouldn't be there.
But Ramaphosa is adamant that Pretoria and Washington, D.C. will thaw their frosty ties.
The noise between our two countries has quietened down, and we are now engaged in serious discussions with the United States, particularly their trade office. And that, for us, is a great advance. Let me add that a number of other countries are still in the woods discussing trade issues with that big market, and they are nowhere near any form of conclusion.
Kylie Khumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.